In section 3.3, we're going to talk about deductive reasoning. So deductive reasoning is the process of reasoning logically from given statements or facts to a conclusion. So if the hypothesis is true, we can assume that the conclusion is true. So if P is true, then Q should be true. That is technically called the law of detachment. So let's talk about a scenario and see if we can conclude anything from the given statements. If Adriana gets an A on her geometry test, she will pass the course. Then we find out that Adriana gets an A on her test. From that, since the hypothesis is true, we can assume the conclusion that she passes the course. In this next example, we're told that if two angles are adjacent, then they share a common vertex. And we're told that two angles share a common vertex. Now we're given kind of the second part of the sentence here, so we can't really make any other conclusion about anything. If the hypothesis is true, we can move forward and say the conclusion is true. If we're given the conclusion, we can't go backwards and say the hypothesis is true. And kind of to show an example of where that makes sense, this is an example. So here are two angles, 1 and 2. They share a common vertex, but they're not adjacent. Remember, adjacent would mean they're next to each other. These are vertical angles. So that's an example or a counterexample that would prove it not true. The next thing we're going to talk about here is the law of syllogism. If P then Q is true, and Q then R is true, then we can make a statement that P then R is true. Now this might seem weird when we see this in letters, but in a word example this might make a little bit more sense. If it's July, then Max is on summer vacation. We're also told that if Max is on summer vacation, then he works as a lifeguard at the local pool. So we can conclude that if it's July, that we can assume that Max is working at a lifeguard at the pool. So notice here that if it's July, then Max is on summer vacation, and then when we're given the conclusion of that first statement, it goes to another conclusion. So we could say the statement of the first can conclude the last statement there. So let's do another example here. If you do gymnastics, then you are flexible. If you do ballet, then you are flexible. We can't make any conclusions here because it's like two separate statements going to the same conclusion. I can't look at that and say, if you do gymnastics, then you do ballet. We could also just think about that logically. That wouldn't really make a ton of sense there either.